I saw this question yesterday when I was browsing the Build a PC subreddit, and it has inspired me to pop in my 3050 and 6600 and retest them to see if it's still as an absolute bloodbath in favor of AMD at the low end like it was when I looked at it about a year ago. So basically this user is struggling with the fact that the computer guy kept on telling me that he's not lying when he said the RTX performs better than the RX 6600. So let's go ahead and visit that question. In the latest games, what about DLSS? What about FSR? What about all of that, different settings, everything? Let's go ahead and dive right in. Also, why are we comparing these two graphics cards? Well, if I wanted to buy a GPU for under $200, I can get an RX 6600 for $180 if I was buying today. Some models cost more. If I wanted to buy an NVIDIA GPU brand new for under $200, I could get an RTX 3050. Now, you have to be super careful right now because NVIDIA released a different version of the 3050 that's significantly worse, but is still called the 3050. That was the 3050 6GB card, which not only reduces the VRAM, but also, it changes the memory bus and the cores. It's just a different graphics card with the same name. So don't buy that one. We've got the 8GB version, which is the original 3050. So if I filter by the 8GB version, this is coming in at $195 for the lowest one, and they kind of go up from there. But this is what NVIDIA has in the $200 and under price range. If you're curious which particular models we're looking at in this video, I have the EVGA Black XC RTX 3050, and the main thing that I thought when I pulled this one out was just like, man, I miss EVGA. How about you guys? And then my AMD RX 6600 we've got tested today is the XFX Swift 210. Probably says Swift. I guess there's no vowel there, so we're going to assume that says Swift, not Swift or Swaft. I don't know. And anyway, we're going to go ahead and pop into the benchmarks, which are all done at the stock settings of the graphics cards, but I do have ResizeBAR and Smart Access Memory enabled, as I am on a platform that enables that by default. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink down out of the way, run the benchmarks, and let's go ahead and see how these things stack up in the latest games. Well, in Ghost of Tsushima at 1080p very high settings, we see the RX 6600 winning by 43% at 60 FPS at max settings, whereas the 3050 can only reach 42. But what about DLSS? Well, if you kick on DLSS, the 3050 reaches 54 frames per second, so it's still under 60 frames per second. And if you use FSR 3.1 without frame generation, just the upscaling at the quality settings here, the 6600 reaches 77 FPS, giving a 43% advantage. However, I would say the image quality is a bit better on the DLSS image, although I'd rather not upscale at 1080p anyway. But so what if I didn't want to upscale? Here we are with the RX 6600 at 1080p native resolution, very high settings, getting a 60 FPS average. Here we are on the RTX 3050 at 1080p very high settings, upscaling from 720p using DLSS quality, looking a bit soft compared to native, and we're still under 60 FPS, meaning you perform worse even using DLSS versus native in this game. Now, speaking of frame generation, with FSR 3.1, you can now use DLSS upscaling with AMD's frame generation on top of it, which is kind of interesting. And also, again, AMD has brought frame generation availability to 30 class NVIDIA GPUs. So here we can use FSR and DLSS upscaling underneath with frame generation on top, but we still see that the AMD card was performing better there. We can also just reduce graphics settings rather than using upscaling and frame generation. So here we're looking at 1080p high settings, where the 3050 is still under 60 FPS at 54, and the 6600 is hitting 79 frames per second, giving it a 46% advantage, and an even larger one in the 1% lows at 70 versus 43, which is like a 63% lead, and you can see the frame time graphs a bit spikier on that 3050. Again, you can use upscaling. Don't love to do it at 1080p, but if you did, 1080p high settings with DLSS quality does get the 3050 up to 71 frames per second, and the RX 6600 up to 101 frames per second if we use FSR quality. But again, you could just leave the FSR upscaling off and still have the lead here over the NVIDIA GPU with upscaling on. If we go down to medium settings, the 3050 is finally able to average 60 frames per second, but at these settings, the 6600 can hit 87, giving it a 45% advantage, and even larger in the 1% lows. And notice again here that means that the 3050 at medium settings is getting the same frame rate that we got on the RX 6600 at maximum settings. So yeah. Anyway, what if we went all the way down to low settings? Well, if we go all the way down to low settings, the 3050 is hitting 71 frames per second, but our RX 6600 is hitting 102 frames per second average, giving it a 44% advantage. And again, the frame time graph still looks a bit spiky on that 3050, leading to an even larger lead in the 1% lows for the RX 6600. Now, that being said, not every game is quite that dramatic of a victory for the RX 6600, so they're not all going to be over a 40% win. But if we move to the latest like Unreal Engine 5 showcase type game with Hellblade 2 at 1080p high, honestly, neither GPU is doing great at max settings here, but it is a 28% lead for the RX 6600 at 32 FPS versus 25 average. It's a 32% lead in the 1% lows at 29 versus 22. Realistically, you wouldn't use those settings though, so one option is to upscale, with which Unreal Engine 5 kind of seems to be built around with a lot of its features. Don't love doing it at 1080p, but if we use DLSS quality, and here I'm using TSR rather than FSR quality because I think it looks a bit better, although performs slightly worse than FSR here. The 6600 still maintains a 24% lead, with 46 FPS versus 37. If we want to stay at native resolution, we could try dropping to 1080p medium settings, where the RX 6600 hits 47 FPS average, and the 3050 hits 38. That's a 24% advantage for the RX 6600, and in the 1% lows as well at 41 versus 33. Again, you could use upscaling at 1080p here since our frame rates are fairly low. And if we do that, once again, I'm showing DLSS quality versus TSR quality, so they're the same internal resolution. I still would give a bit of an image quality advantage to DLSS, but TSR looks fairly usable here. Don't love it at 1080p, but either way, we're now breaking 60 FPS on the 6600 with 65 average versus 53 FPS on the 3050, so a 23% lead for the RX 6600 and a 32% lead in the 1% lows. If we go all the way down to the low settings, we'll see that actually neither of these GPUs, even at the lowest settings in the game, can hold a 60 FPS average. The 6600 gets a lot closer though at 56 FPS versus the 45 FPS average on the RTX 3050. Now, to be fair, these are low settings, but they still look quite good. And you don't really need 60 FPS to play this particular game. But you could upscale off of the low settings as a baseline, and this does get both GPUs over 60 FPS, with the 3050 reaching 66 frames per second, but the 6600 hitting 80, which is a 21% advantage, although it has a 30% lead in the 1% lows at 70 versus 54. And again, that was using TSR rather than FSR for the Unreal Engine 5 games, because I feel like it does have an image quality advantage there compared to FSR. Now, let's move on to Horizon Forbidden West at 1080p very high settings. Wait a second, the 6600's lead is only 5%, and it's actually the 3050 ahead in the 1% lows by 6%. What's going on here? Well, I know from testing other graphics cards that what's happening here is both of them are running over their VRAM limits. So that's reducing the performance on both of them. So if we reduce it down to high settings, the VRAM comes under control here, and we see the RX 6600 go up to 54 frames per second, whereas the 3050 didn't really climb a lot in performance there. So the 6600 is taking a 29% lead now when we reduce it to the high settings, although the 1% lows are only a 14% lead at 42 versus 37. Now we can keep on playing with settings. Again, what if you're going to use DLSS? Well, you can use FSR on the RX 6600. And actually, the performance difference here is only 13% in the averages and only 4% in the 1% lows. So I'm almost wondering if somehow we are still seeing a little bit of a VRAM issue coming into play here to explain these performance differences. It is still a win for the 6600, but it's only 60 FPS versus 53. However, if we drop down to medium settings, it looks like the RX 6600 can kind of stretch its legs here at 74 FPS versus 56, giving it a 32% advantage. By the way, as a side note, when I mentioned the VRAM differences, you might be like, they're both 8GB cards, but I have noticed that AMD can sometimes use more VRAM at the same settings than NVIDIA does, which I think can sometimes cause issues on the 8GB cards for AMD when they're not having issues on the NVIDIA counterpart. Something to keep our eye out for. Anyway, if we're at 1080p medium settings with DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, we see the 6600 hitting 90 FPS, whereas the 3050 is hitting 71. That's a 27% advantage for the RX 6600, and it's also a 27% advantage in the 1% lows at 79 versus 62. If we go all the way down to low settings in this game, we're seeing 85 FPS for the RX 6600 versus 62 FPS on the 3050, which is actually a 37% lead now for the RX 6600 and a 41% lead in the 1% lows at 76 versus 54. So the 3050 can break a 60 FPS average here, but only at the low settings. If we move into Starfield, honestly, neither GPU does amazing at 1080p Ultra. We're seeing 33 FPS versus 29, which is a 14% lead for the RX 6600, and a 17% lead in the 1% lows at 27 versus 23. However, I don't think these are the kinds of frame rates you'd be looking for on either graphics card, so we're going to adjust the settings. If we go down to medium settings, we now see the RX 6600 hitting 50 FPS versus 44 on the 3050, so a 14% lead. So this just seems to be a game where the 3050 performs closer to the RX 6600 than we have seen in the other tests. However, it is also still a win, 14% for the RX 6600. The 1% lows at 43 versus 37. If we go ahead and use upscaling off of the medium settings, that gets the 6600 up to 60 FPS and the 3050 to 56, and I'd say the DLSS image quality does look a bit more stable here than FSR. So this one I'd say is one of the better showings for the 3050 if these were the settings you were going to use to play the game. Unfortunately, if you go down to the low settings to try to stay at native resolution, things just look absolutely horrible in Starfield at low settings. It does get the 6600 to 63 FPS average, which gives it a 19% lead over the 53 FPS average for the RTX 3050. But again, if you just look at everything, it just looks bad. Now, this is using the low preset, so kind of low on everything. If you did more of a customized settings, I think you'd get a much better look out of it, because certain settings were really destroying the image quality there. If we use the low preset and upscale with DLSS and FSR at the quality settings here, we're hitting 69, nice on the 3050, and 75 on the 6600, which is a 9% advantage for the 6600. But again, the low settings already looked pretty bad, and now we're upscaling on top of it, so it looks really soft. And just in general, I don't think this would be a great way to play the game, and Starfield in general seems kind of unoptimized for the visuals that you're getting out of it. If we take a look at Cyberpunk at 1080p Ultra settings, the RX 6600 can average 60 FPS in the built-in benchmark, whereas the 3050 gets 50 FPS, giving a 20% advantage to the 6600 and a 23% advantage in the 1% lows at 49 versus 40. But hey, what about ray tracing? Cyberpunk's kind of a ray tracing showcase. Well, let's not kick on path tracing because that destroys both GPUs. I tried just using RT reflections off of the Ultra preset as a baseline, and even that doesn't get a good experience. Even the 3050, which does beat the 6600 by 29%, is only hitting a 36 FPS average with 1% lows at 28. So it's really just probably not settings that you would use to play the game. Now, we could use DLSS and FSR upscaling off of the 1080p Ultra with RT reflections settings, which now does get the 3050 up to 56 FPS average, giving it a 12% lead over the RX 6600, and DLSS has better image quality. However, again, I'm not sure upscaling at 1080p is worth it just to get those ray traced reflections. If you look at the palm tree branches, for example, now they look very shimmery because we're upscaling, looked a lot more stable when we weren't. So anyway, what if instead of, turning on ray tracing on this class of GPU, you actually turn down settings, which I think makes a lot more sense. If we go down to 1080p high settings, the 3050 can hit 59 FPS average, so almost matching what the 6600 could do at Ultra, but now the 6600 can hit 68 FPS average, giving it a 15% advantage and a 17% advantage in the 1% lows. We could drop down to the medium settings, where the 3050 now hits 70 FPS average and the 6600 hits 84, giving it a 20% advantage to AMD here and a 22% advantage in the 1% lows at 71 versus 58. So definitely a win here for the AMD graphics card if you're not using ray tracing in Cyberpunk. What about some other ray tracing titles? Well, I tried out Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora at 1080p Ultra. Neither GPU did great, but this game is using ray tracing at all times. However, I was surprised to see that the AMD card's 22% ahead. It's 33 FPS versus 27, but that is the result that I got. I was careful to restart the game when changing settings, and everything seemed to be consistent and repeatable, but this is the result I'm getting. At 1080p medium settings, which again includes some level of ray tracing, I'm seeing the RX 6600 winning by 22% at 50 FPS versus 41. And the 1% lows are 40 versus 34, so an 18% advantage here for the RX 6600. If we go ahead and use 1080p medium settings, but use upscaling with DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, I do think the DLSS image quality looks better, although again, don't really like upscaling on 1080p resolution if it could be avoided. But now the 6600 is hitting 69, nice, and the 3050 is hitting 58, which is a 19% lead for the 6600, although the 3050 is ahead in the 1% lows by 13% at 45 versus 40. And if we go all the way down to the low settings, but keep it at native resolution, the 6600 is winning by 22% at 56 FPS average, and the 3050 is hitting a 46 FPS average. Our 1% lows are 45 versus 39, giving a 15% lead for the RX 6600. So neither GPU is going to hit 60 FPS average without upscaling. If we do upscale, then again, I do think image quality advantage here for DLSS, especially if you look at things like the fence line on the base there, things like that, much less flickery. But again, I don't think either one looks particularly great. And we're getting a 20% lead for the 6600 here at 77 FPS versus 64 on the 3050. 1% lows are closer at 54 versus 51, which is 6% lead for the 6600. Let's check out some other games that have ray tracing. Resident Evil 4 at 1080p max settings does include some ray traced reflections. However, this really, as I've seen in other GPU tests I've done, uses more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, causing the 1% lows to be stuttery. Look at the frame time graphs here. So while it's a big win for the 3050, neither GPU is doing well, with major stutters on both of them. If we go down to 1080p prioritized graphics, which does not use ray tracing, now both GPUs are performing well with much smoother frame time graphs, but it is a 24% advantage for the RX 6600 at 83 versus 67 FPS. So again, this is just another example that while the 3050 can have some advantages in certain ray tracing titles, I think in general at this class of performance, it just makes sense to turn ray tracing off in most cases. Here's another example of that. Alan Wake 2 being a big ray tracing showcase. If you try to kick on the ray tracing low settings even, and use DLSS and FSR quality off of the high preset as a baseline, so again, this isn't even the max ray tracing settings, both GPUs are doing terribly, with the 3050 down at 23 FPS and 18 FPS on the 6600. Sure, it's a win for the 3050, but you would never use these settings. Even if you turn off the ray tracing and go back to native resolution, which is 1080p high settings, neither GPU is doing particularly great, but the 6600 does take a 21% lead in the averages at 35 versus 29. However, it's losing in the 1% lows by 21%, with 23 FPS versus 19 for the 3050 advantage in the 1% lows. If we go down to DLSS and FSR quality at the high settings as a baseline. Now we're seeing the RX 6600 take a 30% advantage in the averages at 52 versus 40, but they're actually tied in the 1% lows, which means you'll get a less consistent frame rate out of the 6600 here. And in general, the frame time graph looks a bit spiky. This is a game where I've seen many of my AMD graphics cards struggle with the spiky frame time graph and stutters in the 1% lows in this particular game. And that is what we're seeing here. For example, at 1080p medium, we see the 6600 take a 23% lead in the averages at 38 versus 31, but the 1% lows are down at 17, giving the 3050 a 41% lead in the 1% lows at 24 versus 17. If we use DLSS and FSR quality on the medium baseline preset, we're seeing the 6600 take a 33% advantage in the averages at 56 versus 42. But again, a less consistent frame time graph, with only matching the 3050 in the 1% lows at 32 FPS. So again, just some frame time consistency issues in Alan Wake 2 for the AMD hardware, which, like I said, I have seen before on some of the other AMD cards I've tested here, and on various driver versions and game version updates as well. Here at 1080p medium settings, sorry, this says, it says medium low, sorry. Get rid of the medium here. We're on low settings, okay? At low settings, we're at 43 FPS versus 37, 16% advantage for AMD, but not good 1% lows. Again, cover up the medium settings. This is low settings with DLSS/FSR quality. We're seeing, again, a 30% advantage for AMD, and the averages, 65 versus 50, but the 1% lows are way down at 25, spiky frame time graph. So the 3050 is winning by 52% in the 1% lows. So not great frame time consistency in Alan Wake 2 in particular, but other games were looking pretty good. If we go to Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 at 1080p basic settings, we see a massive 56% lead for the RX 6600 in the built-in benchmark at 169 versus 108 FPS average, and the 1% lows are also a 56% lead at 103 versus 66. So pretty crushing victory there for AMD. So let's pop out for some final thoughts. So in general, the RX 6600 ranged from about 15% or so faster in a game like Starfield to 56% faster in a game like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, with everything in between. We saw, generally over a 40% lead in Ghost of Tsushima, depending on the exact graphic settings. 25-ish, 20 to 25% leads in the Unreal Engine 5 test with Hellblade 2. And we saw in Horizon Forbidden West, generally, it could be VRAM issues at times limiting it, but when we weren't VRAM limited, closer to that 25 to 30% performance advantage in Horizon Forbidden West. Again, Starfield was only more like a 14% or even less at certain settings lead. Cyberpunk was a 20% lead when we weren't ray tracing most of the time. When we were ray tracing, the 3050 could take a lead, but it was probably not reaching frame rates that we'd want to actually use unless we were upscaling at 1080p, causing some image quality issues in like the palm tree branches and stuff like that. So probably not that useful of a ray tracing experience in Cyberpunk. In the Avatar tests, we actually saw the 6600 consistently ahead, despite those being ray tracing tests. In another ray tracing test with Resident Evil, again, the 3050 was winning, but both cards were doing terribly due to running out of VRAM, so they had spiky frame time graphs, very stuttery. So again, another situation where you'd want to turn ray tracing off, where the 6600 is now 24% faster. Alan Wake 2 is another game with unplayably low frame rates when using ray tracing on both graphics cards, in this case, even when you're upscaling at 1080p resolution. Although Alan Wake 2, even with ray tracing off, was an example where, while the 6600 was ahead in the averages, it generally had inconsistent frame times, causing a slightly more stuttery gameplay experience. So this is one of the places where we did see the 6600 maybe have a bit of a struggle. But then, like I said, when we got to Call of Duty, it was a bloodbath in favor of AMD here at a 56% advantage. So, in other words, to summarize, The few places where the 3050 won tended to be with certain ray tracing workloads, but not all of them, but generally the performance at those ray tracing workloads was so low that you wouldn't want to use it anyway. What about DLSS versus FSR? I think at 1080p resolution, DLSS does look noticeably better than FSR, but I'd rather not upscale at all at 1080p because I don't think either one looks great. And we can see examples where, sure, maybe you'd be more likely to use upscaling on the 3050 than the 6600 due to it working better, but you might honestly just still be at a similar or even worse frame rate on the 3050 when upscaling versus the 6600 when you're not upscaling, which I think kind of makes the upscaling advantage a bit moot here. Which is why overall, I'm reaching the same conclusion I reached a year ago when I revisited these and back when they first came out, which is that the RX 6600 is just significantly faster than the RTX 3050 for gaming at 1080p, and the ray tracing advantages just don't matter when you're going to be wanting to turn ray tracing off even on the 3050 to get better performance, and the upscaling advantages are a bit moot when you have such a high advantage just at native rendering that the DLSS is needed just to try to keep up, and upscaling at 1080p, where I think image quality-wise, DLSS does have a more noticeable advantage. I think it still doesn't mean it's as good as native resolution, and I'd rather try to play it native when possible. So with all of that in mind, if our Build a PC subreddit questioner is watching this, probably not, I would say definitely tell the computer guy that you'd like to switch to your switch to the RX 6600. He also asked about things like power efficiency. One thing I'll mention here is that with the 6000 series of AMD GPUs, they to software did not report the full total board power. So this would actually probably, while it's reporting here at 100 watts, in reality, the full graphics card would probably be drawing closer to 120 watts, which is about what the 3050 is drawing. So these are actually running at roughly the same power levels from how many watts they're drawing perspective, whereas the 6600 delivers, again, significantly better performance at that same power consumption. So that would be about the same amount of power, but better efficiency in terms of performance per watt for the AMD card. The other question was, does AMD have a lot of issues? Someone mentioned it to me. So this is one of those things that's really hard for somebody like me to come up with an objective answer to, because in all of the testing I did here, I had no driver crashes or anything on either GPU. So in all of the testing I did for this video, I would say they have the same stability. There were no issues on either GPU. We did see some 1% lows, kind of stuttery stuff in Alan Wake 2 in particular, but in other games, the AMD GPU is just significantly outperforming it. And I can't test all of the tens of thousands of video games that exist to see which ones work and which ones don't on either GPU. So all I can say is that if you kind of follow what people are saying and complaining about online, you can see people complain about both. And generally, AMD had a lot more complaints years ago and seems to have improved significantly since then. The place where I think it might be more important to note differences would be outside of gaming, things like NVIDIA's CUDA support and productivity software, which oftentimes are just programmed for the market share leader, which is NVIDIA, and some things run better on NVIDIA hardware. However, again, we're talking, I'm talking about gaming GPUs here, so I focus on the gaming situation. So if you use productivity use cases, you should research those, which particular programs you use, and try to find benchmarks for that particular program, because some productivity stuff runs great on AMD, some doesn't. And again, it can just depend on which ones in particular you're looking at. So overall here, I would say still big win for the RX 6600 versus that 3050. I'm also interested in revisiting other lower tier graphics cards. So in an upcoming video, I plan on running my Arc A750 through these same tests because it's hanging out in the similar price point. And their drivers have been getting a lot better. So I'm curious what my updated experience will be with the A750, so stay tuned for that. And I'd also, like I said, want to get the 6650 XT in here because it's not that much more money, but can provide a good bit more performance than the GPUs we saw in today's video. So anyway, hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and I hope all of you have an excellent day. And huge thank you to viewers, subscribers, commenters, channel members who have clicked the join button to directly support the channel financially. That's absolutely huge. No, not everybody's able to do that, but as a thank you, you get early access to certain videos. You get a membership badge on your comments. Your comments are easier for me to find because YouTube has little built-in filters to highlight members' comments to creators, things like that. So massive thank you, but totally understand not everybody's in a position to do that. But anyway, I hope all of you have an excellent day.